tired of compliance talks that put you to sleep? We've got you covered. No slides, no fluff, just real-world insights from two compliance pros with over 50 years of experience. Stay ahead, stay informed, and stay entertained. This is compliance without the boring bits.
Hey, welcome to the next episode of Compliance Without the Boring Bits. I'm here with Gustav again, third episode, and we're really excited about today's episode, right, aren't we, Gustav?
Yes, and actually, when we see how many people are watching and listening to us, that is a figure that's only growing and growing, and that's makes me very happy, to have that honor to have people listen to us.
Oh, scary at the same time. Yeah.
What have you been up to, Markus?
Yes. Recently just traveled to New York just to find out what compliance is doing in the US and how we can help.
That is dedication. I was in the US as well, attending, an e-invoicing conference there, and I think what I discovered there, or not discovered, but really reinforced my previous understanding as well, is how different people who work with AP, AR, and tax in their tax see compliance compared to the people working in IT, how they see compliance. And really, and that's something we see when we get customers contacting us as well, businesses contacting us. When it's IT driven, they have different requirements than when it's say functionally driven in terms
It's a
of
battle.
compliance.
It's a battle. Who owns it? Who is going to be the owner of this very important and sensitive topic? And I think we're going to see a shift there in the upcoming future.
A shift to what?
Well, a shift away from IT owning it and grabbing it towards AP, the finance people, the tax people basically owning it and making sure they have control over it. Because so far, a lot of things done by IT that the finance administration or the finance departments are not fully aware of. So with all the rules becoming stricter and more enforced, I think the finance people will gain ownership.
And this is something we should come back to as well. This, about having the fiscal compliance, which is, I think, what IT is looking for, versus the functional, the commercial compliance, which is what the rest of the organization will be looking for. But hey, let's move on to some real life cases about this.
Yeah, let's do that.
With the real life cases, you mentioned the US already, and this is something that's really a hot topic, both when I talk to businesses, when you talk to businesses, as well as internally, and the key word there is tariffs and how the tariffs impact invoices. We've seen tariffs going up and down with very little notice. And what does this mean, Markus, in your opinion, for an AP or AR manager?
Well, I think tariffs in the wider context are similar to impacting businesses similar as for example, sanctions. So for me, first and foremost, if I look at tariffs, it's where do I source, right? And what are the impacts? What are the implications? So for me, tariffs are not necessarily a direct impact on the actual invoices, while indirectly, of course, if you're changing where you're sourcing from, where your supplier sits, which country, then of course there is an impact on the invoice. But at the very beginning, it's more the procurement departments that are looking into supply chain design and planning items, and ultimately they will have an impact on the invoice, which is the final document in the whole chain. But at this very moment, I'm thinking that too many people are expecting impacts on invoices where most of the impact is more upstream before the invoice starts.
So the actual impact might be more on you working with your suppliers and making sure that you have good relations with your suppliers and be able to onboard those and so on, right? Look from the AP manager's perspective.
No, and I think that is actually absolutely right. And I think from a tariffs perspective, what happens, right? It's the tariffs are applicable when the goods are imported, right? So, and it's not for domestic invoices, right? So you need to be really clear about which processes are we looking at and which processes are we talking about. So it's importing goods from another country or exporting goods to another country, where you need to then actually make sure that the tariffs are applied appropriately. And most things are getting more expensive, right? So the invoice has a higher value, but that doesn't mean that the invoice itself is affected as a document from the rules perspective, because tariffs have been here for a longer time. They were just, smaller.
It's nothing new, exactly. The only thing new is how much they are, right? But there
Yeah.
is one document that is affected that is almost an invoice, isn't there? The pro forma invoice.
Yeah, all those documents that are associated to the process of exporting and importing goods, right? Customs documentation. And that's always been like a totally separate but very convoluted and complex process. I mean, there's still a lot of paper involved. There are still lots of stamps with defined ink involved and all that kind of stuff. So yes, there are documents, pro forma invoices that are associated with the shipment of goods across borders. All these things are effective as well. Yes, definitely.
Hmm. And another effect I can imagine would be you need to be more diligent on fraud checks and so on when your supply chain changes. You need to work out, that the payment terms are important, all that.
I think overall, and you know this from your experience as well, Gustav, it's about process design, right? And these kinds of things are events that are impacting the process design overall. So what is put to the test here
I
is
have to bring this
probably
up when you say process design, Marcus. Come on.
really, oh
But
come on, that's so sad. That's so sad. So okay, so in a less boring way, you change the way
mm,
you work. You change the way who you're working with. You have to make changes in your own internal setup, right? You need to have people who can, in an agile environment, respond to these kinds of changes. So less boring, maybe. This is very exciting,
yeah.
actually, because it's also very challenging. Because as we see, most businesses are not agile. Most businesses are very much trapped in their tracks. And so they need to actually become a lot more nimble when it comes to these kinds of responses that they need to have for
mm.
these changes.
And I think what you said earlier is what I would round up the tariff discussion is about, is that this is nothing new. This is something that has been going on for years over years over years. The only thing new is the amount, or the amount, both the amount of the tariff and how many there is per
Oh.
document, right?
And in a nutshell, the tariffs could be compared to a ship that is stuck on the Suez Canal. All of a sudden, you're not getting your stuff from where you're used to getting it from. All of a
Hmm.
sudden, you need to actually respond very quickly. How do you do this? Is your supply chain breaking down? Is your manufacturing actually coming to a standstill? These are the challenges. And that's actually not boring. So don't raise that sign on me again. But that is actually where the things are becoming very interesting. And I think this is also, again, an opportunity for businesses to implement more agile and flexible processes, I think, at least from my perspective.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, there's opportunity. I was thinking, what is the driver? What is the driver that would put some kind of external fire on the people doing this? There's no like clear thing happening compared to before, except the amount and so on. But
Fire down below. I think everything that happens to a business in their process, in their daily business, anything that happens that has a direct impact is a driver for change. That's in a nutshell my
I
perspective.
love that you say this, Marcus, because I want to move on to another topic here, and that is that you and I would talk about automation and how about e-invoice, the savior for automation, and how it can, really help you. And the mandates are a conduit for e-invoicing, right?
Yeah.
But what I've been hearing are companies saying exactly the opposite. And so I had a talk to some of the people who work with implementing e-invoicing mandates here at the company, and I was given a very good example where a big customer of ours in Romania, they had more than 80% automation of their incoming invoices. And when I say automation, meant no touches at all. The invoice came in, nobody touched it until it was paid. But then the Romanian invoicing mandate came, and they went from 80% down to 30%. And the
Ooh.
reason was that they had to retrain their whole supply chain on what data to put where. Because the Romanian mandate forced the invoices to be shifted over from PDF to e-invoices at a set date, but with no real guidance on where do we put this piece of commercial information, so not legal information, right? And this is something that you and I have discussed as well, the difference between what is required from a legal perspective versus a commercial perspective.
I think the only thing that this shows, and what you're just talking about, the one thing that this shows is that these businesses who are now seeing a decrease in automation have never really embraced electronic invoicing as it was defined as early as the late 1990s, right? Because we've always said electronic invoicing is structured data coming out of the billing system of the supplier and transferred over to the buyer without media breaks, without paper involved, without anything happening, right? But the context is on content, right? So what we see and what you've just described is a clear indication that this business has never really embraced that opportunity to go to structured data. What they have probably done is they have read PDFs, they have read paper, they've tried to teach machines to read, right? And all of these things were patched together in a zombie process, and that worked somehow. Now there's a government involved, and the government says, this is what I want from you. That's what we call fiscal compliance, right? We call it commercial compliance when a business is able to pay an invoice. We call it fiscal compliance if the associated government accepts these invoices for tax reclaim. And what this example that you've just given me says is that when marrying these two processes has never really happened based on structured data and based on a focus on content. And that is what we need to come back to. And this is also very important, and thanks for raising this. It's the fundamental difference between so-called e-invoicing service providers who do nothing but integrate data into government platforms. They don't care about commercial compliance. They don't care whether the invoice data coming out of a government in the end will book in the ERP system. That is where the difference sits between e-invoicing service providers. Because if an invoice is fully compliant from a fiscal perspective, does not mean that that invoice actually books in your ERP system, because procurement information isn't there, because the governments don't care about commercial compliance,
No, of course not.
right?
I think one thing I would like to maybe talk against you here, Marcus, is the finger pointing here. You said that business didn't do this and this and this. I think that's true for all businesses. Unless you have a really long-term view and a really holistic approach, the situation they are at is the same across at least 80,
yeah.
90%.
I would disagree. Because the problem really is, there's lots of policies out there, right? How often in your professional life have you heard the term no PO, no pay? Tell me, how often?
Enough so
Everywhere?
yeah. Yes, it's a very, very common term. Yes.
Yes, and how many businesses really who say this enforce this? Do they? What's the PO coverage in an average business? Right? Everyone says we have 90% PO coverage. If that were the case, no one would have to touch the invoices if everything worked properly, right? But the truth is, it's not the case. The truth is, it's not the case. And that's where I think we are looking back. Both of us say we have more than 50 years combined experience in this area. Can we honestly say that we have seen evidence of many businesses really sticking to what they put on a PowerPoint slide when it comes to saying no PO, no pay, and all invoices are being, no. And this is the
but
problem,
this is what
right?
I mean. This is exactly what I mean. So it's not a specific company that was an outlier. I think this is the
No.
normal. The standard is this exactly. So the 80 to 30 is not this one company that was unprepared. This is, the whole industry, or, all the companies will face the same thing.
And that's very true. And the one thing I kept seeing in these past 25 years that I've been doing this job is that people have still not completely understood invoice exceptions originating in a broken procurement process, right? And this is where real process design and real improvement, change management must happen at the very beginning of the whole process, right? If you're just trying to fix the invoicing process, then you're actually neglecting where the problems are originating from. And what you're doing is you're patching a solution. You're patching a process that you should actually fix at the
So if sourcing doesn't do the job correctly, then procurement are the ones who get the shits. And if they don't do it correctly, then it's going to end up on APs and so on, right?
Absolutely.
Let's move on to some hot gossips on what's going on right now. And we have the Brazilian tax reform, and I'm gonna, say that word, and I'm gonna bring this up just for for sakes. What's going on in Brazil? What's the tax reform?
So I would be a bit arrogant and overestimating my impact saying what's going on in Brazil. But what is basically happening in Brazil from a tax perspective is that the government has announced the introduction of dual VAT system, replacing most of the old taxes. And ultimately, that is a fundamental change. Brazil, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I would probably be allowed to say, has one of the most complex tax systems today. And
think
this is
usually
supposed to change.
they're number one or two. It's them and the USA, right? In terms of
Well, the
tax.
US with their sales and use tax is a totally different system, but yeah, Brazil has a very convoluted tax system, and if they're introducing what they have announced now, and the technical notes have been issued as well, then the way invoicing works in these countries is also going to change. But it's
How?
very similar. Well, it's different taxes on the invoice, and that already makes it fundamentally different. So services and goods and all these things and the way they are taxed is going to change, right? Today, goods invoices are directly cleared with the government in a central environment, whereas service invoices are basically cleared with all the different municipalities. And there are literally hundreds of these municipalities, and with all varying technical standards, right? And so this is something that the businesses in Brazil need to prepare for. This is what every business that has a Brazilian affiliate needs to prepare for. So if you've already found Brazil difficult from an e-invoicing perspective before, then you will find it even more difficult now that you have to adopt these changes. But yeah, we're on track. So we're looking at changes 2025 already. So we are looking at some introductions as early as July this year, but next year we're going to see quite some changes. So the taxes are going to be changed, and then following from there, e-invoicing applications have already been updated, and the requirements for e-invoicing solutions have been released. So yeah,
All right.
businesses need to be on the lookout.
As usual.
Well, I'm excited for it.
Let's move on to France and the Secnum Cloud. So we know about the France e-invoicing mandate, and part of this is the Secnum Cloud, which basically defines a few different requirements on whomever interacts with the PPF in France, and those are organizational in terms of
I don't have the boring sign up, but PPF, I find this so
so this is for
boring.
Marcus.
So yeah,
But you have the security requirements on companies who interact with the PPF and so on.
yeah,
And this has an impact as well, right? Because it's not only us service providers who become the so-called PDPs, but also in other ways.
yeah. I think the biggest difficulty that I see in these discussions is that invoicing is mixed with data privacy and data processing. So if we're talking Secnum Cloud, just for the listener that has not necessarily heard about it, it's literally protecting and requiring where the actual data processing happens. And that is a very big problem, not just in France, not just in Europe, but also on a global scale. Like we live in a globalized world, at least as far as I checked last, we still live in a globalized world, and we have services like Amazon Web Services. We have Microsoft Azure and all these kinds of things, right? That means that data is never really truly in one place, in a defined place. And they're introducing these kinds of cybersecurity legislation, like, for example, China with a Great Firewall, right? Everything needs to be in China. Nothing can leave. The US with GovCloud, where no data may leave the country.
Yeah, especially for personal data. Yeah.
Exactly. So these kinds of things make it very difficult for businesses to basically operate. And what we've seen in France is that they're forcing service providers to put their processing into France. The question that you really need to ask yourself is, does that really make a lot of sense? I mean, data privacy is one thing, right? But if it actually starts impacting the way we're doing business, that is an agreed way of doing business, right? Imagine all the sales force, those businesses, all those SaaS providers are making this whole, we're questioning, debating the entire approach to cloud computing. I think that's not a good thing. And then if you are looking at France, it's one country within Europe. Sorry, I need to complete this one because it's very important. It's one country within the European Union that has this kind of requirement now. Imagine what happens or what this means if more European member states implement the same kind of approach. It's a bit difficult for me to understand how that helps.
I know for invoice archiving that we often speak about, there are usually rules that data has to be stored, invoices have to be stored within the country itself. But a lot of the EU countries actually do say that, yes, you can store it in another EU country, as long as you tell us, the government, that you will do so, for example.
You're totally right, but that is again, and thank you for bringing it up. It's again a different dimension. We are talking about data in flight when it's processed, right? That's one thing. And then we are talking data at rest. And I have no issues thinking that it's important that data at rest is in one place, so tax administrations actually understand where is the business information that we are looking for. But when it comes to processing the data, I have my doubts.
And well, so does there's the big discussion as well with Secno Cloud versus Peppol as well. That's going to happen here.
Yeah, I mean, Peppol in the beginning, when it was still a European project, was supposed to be a pan-European platform for procurement online, right? These kinds of things, right? That was the idea. Would you have then requirements to store it in France and to have a processor and data service in France and in Germany and in Italy and in Hungary and in Poland or whatever? No, of course not. It would have been in Luxembourg, where I think they are today, right? And so how does Peppol now play into France? People will ask questions. We've invested a lot of money into enabling Secnum Cloud. So what about Peppol now? Is Peppol going to do this too? I don't know. Maybe someone's going to give the answer shortly.
Yeah, let's see when and if that happens, Markus.
Sure.
Hot gossip, another topic that you and I were discussing is Africa. That is often overlooked among our customers. And I mean overlooked in terms of that they don't really put much effort there from a centralized perspective, but Africa is handled locally by the local people in terms of e-invoicing compliance.
Yeah.
And Africa, I think what differs in Africa compared to many other countries is how e-invoicing mandates are done there. They are usually focused on point of sale devices that have to be connected to the central platform. Compare that to where, Europe and Latin and so on, we have more of a central platform that you connect to via service providers or whatnot. Whereas in Africa, it's more of like an actual hardware device that is connected and so on.
Yeah. And I think it's totally true and it's totally fine. I mean, this is a different world again, much lower volumes, and the focus of the tax administrations is on a different part of the process. And so I think it's totally fine. But I see a lot of movement in Africa as well. Lots of mandates being announced, and I think it's going to be interesting whether they also continue on some of the conversations that they've started to build something like an African network as well. Quite interesting. I think the banks are quite involved in that one as well.
Yes, I remember reading about an initiative in Africa about digitalization for payments as well happening. Yeah.
Well, we're here in the US where it was called the Business Payments Coalition. I mean, you wouldn't want to compare the ongoing proceedings in the US with what's going on in Africa, but it shows you that the focus on what they are trying to achieve sometimes varies from what we're used to in other parts of this world. And again, for global businesses, that is the challenge that they need to embrace, and that is the approach they need to find. How do I actually work in all these different geographies and parts of the world?
Markus, you know what? You and I have different views on Vida and what's happening there, and we wanted to discuss it a bit now, but I think we're out of time, Markus, really. We need to stay that for the next time. So, to summarize, we started with the US and tariffs, right? Went on to talk about automation and how automation really is not automatic just because you get the invoices. And then went through the Brazil tax reform, Second Cloud, and now Africa a bit. That's it for today, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's been a nice journey through all the things that are currently attacking the businesses. And I think just a quick one on Vida, it's rules. Rules are being published every single day, right? And Vida is supposed to facilitate. But we will see how this actually pans out across Europe. I think this is like the to me it's a petri dish. The European Union is really like trying a lot of things. Not a lot of things work in concerted and coordinated ways. So we will see. Let's talk about Vida in the next session.
All right. Petri dish for me means that you plant something and it grows. So I think
Sometimes it
see
does.
technology in different ways. But
We'll see.
so stay tuned, I think, for both us talking about Vida, but also I want to go deeper into US and how about compliance there, because even though there's no e-invoicing mandate, there's still compliance. There's still compliance, right? So let's come
There's a
back
lot
to
of
those
compliance.
topics.
I will bring that with me when I'm back from holidays.
All right. I
Okay?
usually bring candy for the kids, but if you want to bring compliance, that's fine for you. Thanks all for listening and watching today.
Thank you so much, guys.
And that's a wrap. Thank you. Join us again next quarter for compliance without the boring bits.